talk. Don and I are going to discuss our top 10 interview tips. The first one is to emphasize the critical role of interviewing at the start of all training classes. And I would add to that to emphasize the importance of a good interview throughout the training classes. One thing that I do with new volunteers when we're talking about whether a state refund's taxable, and did they itemize last year? And I'll say, how do you know if they itemized last year? And they all kind of look at me like deer in the headlights, and then they start fumbling through all their training material and the intake sheet, and then of course the correct answer is you ask them, you talk to them. So in fact, then I'll say something like, whenever I ask how do you know something, the answer probably is going to be, at least in part, that you asked the taxpayer. Anything else on that one, Don?
No, I agree with you, Barb, and like you said, we as site coordinators or training instructors, throughout the process, I think Barb hits it so well, is to ask questions when you're going over a tax law topic. How would you get the taxpayer to give you the answer you need to properly make a determination on that tax law? So interspersed throughout the training, try to get them to be thinking not only how am I going to make this correct tax law determination, but how am I going to get the information from the taxpayer that allows me to make the appropriate decision.
Thank you. Okay, the second item is provide volunteers sample interviews and training. I think it's really beneficial in an in-person training class to have two instructors or an instructor with an experienced volunteer, and so there's two of you and you can demonstrate how to conduct a good interview. And I think it's really helpful, actually, to base that off a sample 13614C, because that's what the volunteer is going to be working off of. That they're looking at that 13614C. Now, what do you ask? Also, some organizations make videos of good interviews. Maybe you could even do bad and good interviews, and just so people can see, because a lot of our new volunteers have never talked to anybody about taxes before. They've never asked strangers personal questions about who's the father of your child and that kind of thing. So it's really good to see a sample and to know that it's okay to delve into these things and to really push for the correct answer. The next item is allow volunteers the opportunity to do role plays during class. This is something in an organization here in Chicago that I do training for that we started a few years ago, where we give the volunteers, everybody in the class, a sample scenario, and then we say get into pairs, and one of you be the client and one of you be the preparer, and find out the correct filing status or determine what's the story on their cash income, whatever it might be. And it is time-consuming. A lot of instructors feel like it, oh, I don't have time to do that. It's kind of awkward, but I've got to tell you, it's hugely beneficial. Because after we run the role play, so they all simultaneously just do their little interview, and then we talk about it. What was it like to ask those questions? What was it like for somebody to quiz you about these things and to pursue you? What was it like to be the taxpayer? So I think it has a lot of benefits. Sometimes we'll do one where we'll have the two instructors do the interview, the part of the interview, and show everybody the right way to do it, and then you have them break into pairs and tell them, okay, now you do the interview, and they still struggle. That's how challenging I think this is, even though they just saw a good way to do it. So I think it's really nice that the first interview they do is not a real interview with a real taxpayer, so give them a chance to practice. Anything you want to add to that, Don?
Yeah, I do, Barbara. I'm like you. I don't think we can overemphasize how critical this could be to the entire free tax operation in your community. To Barb's point, when I have talked to volunteers who have had this opportunity in training, their success and their enjoyment of the opportunity of doing taxes is so greatly enhanced by the fact that the first day they came out, they had a little bit of a feeling of what it was going to be like, and so they weren't overwhelmed. I think all of us know if we can get volunteers past this first year, and it is a tough first year, and especially this year if this is their first year with ACA, we have a much better chance of keeping them long term And volunteers are the key to the long-term success of the VITA program. So I think the more we can teach our volunteers what it's going to be like. It's great that they know tax law. It's great that they understand tax-wise. But the part that throws them is the interaction with the taxpayer. And the only way to do that is to give them opportunities in this training in a controlled environment to see what it's going to be like. And so I like Barb, cannot overemphasize the value of doing this.
Thanks, Don. Number 4 is assume that the taxpayer wants to provide the correct tax information. To me, it's fascinating that Don, sitting in the waiting area, was able to understand how sincere the clients are and how hard they try to do things right. It is my experience that the vast majority of VITA clients are absolutely guileless. They want to provide the right information. And I think sometimes when we approach it in a different way, we think they're trying to pull something or whatever. We just get in our own way doing that. Just ask them the questions and pursue the topic until you get all the information you need. And I think that's the assumption to make, is that they're trying to do it right. The next one is don't assume that the taxpayer understands the questions. Many of our clients do not understand the questions on the 13614C and maybe not even the questions that we're asking them. I think a beautiful example is we ask everybody, is there anybody that can claim you as a dependent? And sometimes we don't hardly know the answer to that, let alone the clients, because they're not taxpayers. They don't know the rules. And so I think that's one, I think it's question 13 on page 1, that if there's any doubt as to the accuracy of that answer, that we always want to follow up on that one, because that requires knowledge of tax law, really, to answer that correctly. Okay, on the next slide, we've got number 6. Utilize the intake interview sheet as a guide for asking questions. And I think Don actually talked about this quite a bit, but I just want to say that we teach that if they answer any of those questions unsure, particularly on page 2, that we want to follow up with that and find out what the correct answer is. But I think any question that seems really relevant to that taxpayer situation, you kind of just assume that they're unsure about the answer. They know if they have W-2s. There's a few that, you know, are pretty obvious, but I really think it's important to take the tax that they really don't maybe understand what's all on the 13614C.
And Barb, I wanted to add to that. I agree so wholeheartedly with you on that. And I think one of the prime examples on that, I think one that we as a volunteer tax preparers sometimes overlook, is the entire part about children, about whether they live with them, whether they provided 100%. They do not know any of that. And so I think most times we as preparers look at that and go, boom, there it is. They've given me all the answers. I think that's a prime example. Even though an answer is there, that is one that requires, that's just a guide. That's just a starting point for us to say, okay, let's talk about these children.
Thanks. Okay, number 7, interview taxpayers without the computer first. So this is my thing. I think whenever we sit down with a client, we should not start making entries into the computer. I try to teach volunteers, you want to go over the intake sheet, have a nice thorough interview with the client. You may not ask every single thing, but you want to get the lay of the land, what the information is, what you're dealing with there. And it's a great opportunity to make eye contact and develop a rapport before doing data entry. So I think it's really an important point to, particularly with new volunteers, they're afraid they kind of want to hide behind that monitor. And we want them to actually get over to the side and talk to the taxpayer before they start actually preparing the return on tax-wise. The next item, number 8, is obtain an answer to every item on the intake sheet. So often I go to do quality review and there's questions on the 13614C that have not been answered, and it's really important to make sure we get an answer to every question, even though we think we know the answer. I think just Saturday I sat across from an 18-year-old young man. We had just prepared his return, and I looked him in the eyes and I said, did you adopt a child last year? Because that had not been answered. And, you know, there's a reason that all those are on there. So it's important to always give the answer to all the questions. Anything you want to add to that, Don?
No, I totally agree.
Okay. Number 9, employ open-ended questions that include terms the taxpayer would understand. We saw an example of using an open-ended question in our scenarios. One that I always go to is there's a question on page 2 of the 13614C. Says, did you have earned income credit disallowed in prior years? I don't think our clients understand that question. So I think I encourage the volunteers to ask it a different way, to always follow up. I think a good question is, did you get all your refund last year? Another one is, did you get any mail from the IRS last year? If IRS questioned or disallowed their EIC, they got a blizzard of mail from the IRS. So to ask practical questions that they understand sometimes can uncover the correct answer to that question and many other questions on the 13614C.
And Barb, I just want to add, I think this, again, is one of those most critical things that we can teach our volunteers and tax preparers to do, is to use open-ended questions and let the taxpayer provide you the answers. I always think of one that I think should be a hallmark of every conversation, should be, is there anything else? You know, to your point, after you've interviewed them at the opening before you start data input, and I do think that's critical. As a taxpayer, when I was sitting there, the ones that started right in on the data entry, I never felt like we ever got a rapport, and I just felt like I was there to tick off a couple things. But the ones that sat and asked questions, I felt like we were, you know, on a personal level going back and forth. But I always think that we should provide the taxpayer an opportunity to provide us whatever else they think. Most of the times it will be inconsequential to the tax process, but again, because they don't necessarily understand what the intake sheet is driving at, they might, again, I think that one about the hairdresser, they might not have put that down there, but if we said, did you do anything else? Are there other things that you would do? They're going to tell you, but we've got to give them the opportunity, and if we're just relying on the intake sheet and using our tax verbiage that we're so accustomed to, we won't get to those answers in many instances. So again, always give the taxpayer an opportunity. Is there anything else? Is there any other income? Is there any other expenses you think you're entitled to? And see where that goes.
Right. Thank you. And then finally, number 10 is ensure that the quality review process is a second interview on issues impacting tax law decisions. So there's different ways of doing quality review, but to me, to make it really work right, you have to have the taxpayer, the quality reviewer, and the preparer all present during the review. And that as Don said, it's not just checking that the Social Security numbers have been entered correctly, it's checking that the tax law has been applied correctly and that all the information relevant to the application of the tax law has been gathered. So I'm thinking, for example, our first scenario where she had kind of a muddled marital status. If I was doing a review of that and glancing at the 13614C, my inclination would be she's probably had a household. And if I found out the preparer had, in fact, used head of household, I would still re-interview the taxpayer because it looks like such a confusion. And it could be very brief, but it's a really great way to make sure that we have all the right information, and it's a wonderful opportunity to model a good interview for the preparer, particularly for a new preparer, because they'll sit there and they'll watch and learn how you actually get the right information and conduct a good interview. So I think that's really an important part of quality review. I really consider quality review to be on-the-job training because the new volunteers really need to see the real-life application of these skills to learn how to do it themselves.